Annoying house pets is something that most people have to deal with. From rats to raccoons to possums, they're always annoying to always have to deal with all the time. But there are some house pets out there that aren't those things. Not any bug or animal known to man. Sometimes, these things can be even more dangerous and more nefarious than your typical house pet. That sounds a bit silly, but when you think about it, it may not be too far off. And this story will give a good example of that. So, join me folks, as we read the story of They Want Raccoons. People still give me that look when I show up at their door telling them I'm the pest control technician. I suppose it's because I look a lot younger than most of the other folks in my field of work. I thought this was gonna be a temple ingot, for the first year or two after I dropped out of high school. Well, it's been 5 years and I'm still working here. Insects and rodents never bugged me much. Sorry about the pun. And I never really figured why people were so afraid of them. I mean, just look how big we are compared to how small they are. Then again, I suppose it's easy to get desensitized when you work in this field. A friend of mine who works at the meat shop says the same thing about his job. It's true. If your job was in specializing of doing autopsies on dead bodies, you could probably dig your hands into a human coffin and not even flinch after a while. I've dealt with bed bugs, roaches, beehives, rats, you name it, I took care of it. It's not very often that I run into something that I don't want to deal with. This story is one of those rare occasions where I threw my hands up and said, sorry, call someone else. I might as well just start from the beginning. I've been to Mrs. Thompson's place before. She spotted mouse droppings around the house, so she called us in to get rid of the rodents. It was an enormous house, way too big for one person to live in. Even her cat had a bigger room than I did. My first visit only lasted about 15 minutes. I laid down some snap traps around the house and let them work their magic. 2 weeks later, I dropped by again to check on the traps. 6 mice caught, and no sign of any other. It would be 6 months before we got another call from Mrs. Thompson. This time, it was something else. Her cat, Bingo, had gone missing, and she was damn sure raccoons had something to do with it. She told us that she could hear them at night, creeping in and around the house, only to scurry away every time she went looking for them. Now, I mentioned before that bugs don't bother me much, but raccoons, on the other hand, pose a very real threat. Many of them are rabid and are afraid to attack humans if they feel threatened. I've been taught to deal with them using non-conventional methods, such as placing a bright lamp or loud radio in their selected hiding places. It usually works on raccoons, though. But those things living in whole walls, they weren't raccoons. I entered Mrs. Thompson's house this time. I immediately noticed a subtle but persistent odor. It smelled like what? Something seemed off about her otherwise beautiful Victorian home. Upon closer inspection, I noticed a rusty red substance seeping from the corners of her ceiling. Only small amounts of it, but enough to have a light brown stain. I followed the smell to an air vent in her den, one barely large enough to shove a baby through it. Peering inside, I saw a few rocks of fur, presumably Bingo's. The stench I smelled was foul beyond any words in the human language. When I tried to remove the cover, I realized that whatever critter lurks in Mrs. Thompson's house must have been the manual dexterity of a skilled caper. That or very sharp claws. In the end, I had to pry it open with a knife. Lying flat on my stomach, I reached onto the opening and felt around. That was when I grabbed onto what I thought was a tennis ball and took it out of the hole. Turns out, it was Bingo. Well, actually, it was just their disembodied head. I dealt with dead animals all the time, but I'd be lying if I said that that didn't scare the hell out of me a little. Parts of her spine were still clinging onto it, as if the head was yanked off after a violent struggle. Its eyes were missing too. The way the nerves dangled out of their sockets made it look like something had sucked her eyeballs out. Then I heard it. It shrieked down the duct. A bizarre sound I never heard before. I was lying on my back now, sliding my head further into the hole with a small flashlight clenched between my lips, trying to get a glimpse of the culprit. And then I saw it. The creature was staring right back at me. Its eyes was glazed and was jet black as the night sky. Behind it, dozens of eggs were burrowed into the side of its walls. Some were empty palms, while others were still throbbing with life. I was locked in a scaring contest with this horrendous creature. Hamasa must have been thinking the same thing about me. It hissed and shrieked, this time louder than the first. Whatever that thing was, it did not belong to our world. Its slimy, gray body was dripping with a red, gluey fluid that I mistook for sweat or saliva. Then some of it dripped onto my mouth. I tasted the blood-like rustiness of it. It didn't take a rocket science to know what it was. I pulled myself out of that as fast as humanly possible and spat out whatever it was that was in my mouth. I grabbed my things and darted out from that place, not taking one look back as I ran to my car. I felt bad for leaving Miss Thompson's cat on the floor like that. I realized he must have been very unsettled, heartbroken, and terrified by the sight of her now decapitated dead pet. I kind of expected her to call up the company to file a complaint about me, but she never did. In fact, now that I think of it, I never heard from Miss Thompson again, and no one else I know or I'm familiar with in the neighborhood ever knew what happened to her either. It's probably best not to think about it. 3 days ago, I was dispatched to deal with an infestation at a house not too far from Mrs. Thompson's. I drove by her block and slowed down when I approached her lot. To my surprise, the old house has already been torn down, as well as the houses behind and adjacent to it. I noticed that many of the houses in the area had gone up for sale. There seemed to be nobody in any of the houses in the area anymore. When I drove away from where the house used to be, I heard a shriek coming from behind, echoing in the distance. So as I was about to turn onto the main road, I saw a pack of those slimy gray things in my rearview mirror, crawling across the street towards their next habitat.